No time for it. I put the wrapped sword in my safe box. It barely fitted. As I worked my way back to health, I considered Tantalid. Arno Tantalid had risen from the rank of confessor militant in the Missionaria Galaxia 70 years before to become one of the Ministerum's most feared and ruthless witch hunters. Like many of his breed, he followed the doctrines of Sebastian Thor with such unswerving precision it bordered on clinical obsession. To most of the common folk of the Imperium, there would be blessed little to choose between an Ordo Xenos Inquisitor such as myself and an ecclesiarchy witch-killer like Tantalid. We both hunt out the damning darkness that stalks mankind. We are both figures of fear and dread. We are both, so it seems, laws unto ourselves. Twinned though we may be in so many ways, we could not be more distinct. It is my personal belief that the Adeptus Ministerum, the Imperium's vast organ of faith and worship, should focus its entire attention on the promulgation of the true Church of the God Emperor and leave the persecution of heretics to the Inquisition. Our jurisdictions often clash. There have, to my certain knowledge, been 2 wars of faith in the last century, provoked and sustained by just such rivalry. Tantalid and I had locked horns twice before. On Braddle's world, 5 decades earlier, we had faced each other across the marble floor of a synod court, arguing for the right to extradite the psyker Elbone Parsival. On that occasion he had triumphed, thanks mainly to the strict Thorian mindset of the Ministerum elders of Braddle's world. Then, just 8 years ago, our paths had crossed again on Kumar. Tantalid's fanatical hatred, indeed, I would venture fear, of the psyker was by then insurmountable. I made no secret of the fact that I employed psychic methods in the pursuit of my work. There were psychic adepts in my staff, and I myself had worked to develop my own psychic abilities over the years. Such is my right as an authorized bearer of the Inquisition seal. In my eyes, he was a blinkered zealot with a psychotic streak. In his, I was the spawn of witches and a heretic. No courtroom argument for us on Kumar. A little war instead. It lasted an afternoon and raged through the tiered streets of the oasis town at Unat Akim. 28 latent psychers, none older than 14, had been rooted out of the population of Kumar's sprawling capital city during a purge, and sequestered prior to their collection by the black ships. They were recruits, a precious resource, untainted and ready to be shaped by the Adeptus Astropathicus into worthy servants of the God Emperor. Some of them, perhaps, would have the ultimate honor of joining the choir of the Astronomicon. They were frightened and confused, but this was their salvation. Better to be found early and turn to good service than to remain undetected and become tainted, corrupt, and a threat to our entire society. But before the black ships could arrive to take them, they were spirited away by renegade slavers working in collusion with corrupt officials in the local administratum. Vast sums could be made on the black market for unregistered, virgin psychic slaves. I followed the slavers' trail across the Saif dunes to Unat Akim with the intention of liberating the youngsters. Tantalid made his way there to exterminate them all as witches. By the end of the fight, I had driven the witchfinder and his cohorts, mostly foot soldiers of the Frateris militia, out of the oasis town. 2 of the young psychers had been killed in the crossfire, but the others were safely transferred into the hands of the Astropathicus. Tantalid, fleeing Kumar to lick his wounds, had tried to have me declared heretic, but the charges were swiftly overturned. The Ministerum had at that time no wish to court conflict with their allies in the Inquisition. I had expected, known even, that Tantalid would return sometime to plague me. It was a personal matter now, one which his fanatical disposition would fix upon and transform into a holy calling. But the last I had heard, he had been leading an ecclesiarchy mission into the Ophidian subsector in support of the century-long purge campaign there. I wondered what had brought him to Lethe 11 at so inopportune a moment. By the time I was back on my feet, 2 weeks later, the dark night was over, and I knew the answer, in general, if not specific terms. I was hobbling around on a cane in the private mansion I had rented in Lethe Major when Amos brought me the news. The great Ophidian campaign was over.
"Great success," he announced. "The last action took place at Dulcine 4 months ago, and the War Master has declared the subsector cleansed. A famous victory, don't you think?"
Yes, I should hope so. It's taken them long enough.
Gregor, Gregor. Even with a force as large as the hallowed battle fleet Scarus, the subjugation of a subsector is an immense task. That it took the best part of a century is nothing. The pacification of the extempus subsector took 400 years.
He paused.
You're toying with me, aren't you?
I nodded. He was very easy to wind up. Amos shook his head and eased his ancient body down into one of the leather chairs.
Martial law still dominates, I understand, and caretaker governments have been established on the key worlds. But the War Master himself is returning with the bulk of the fleet in triumph, setting foot in this subsector again for the first time in 100 years.
I stood by the open windows, looking out from the mansion's first floor across the grey roofs of Lethe Major, which seemed to coat the hills of the Tyto Basin like the scaled hide of some prehistoric reptile. The sky was a magnolia haze, and a light breeze breathed. It was almost impossible now to picture this place beset by the filthy, permanent shadows of the dark night. Now, perhaps, I knew why Tantalid had returned. The Ophidian War was over, and his holy mission concluded with it. I remember them setting out, don't you? I asked. A foolish question. My savant was a data addict, driven since the age of 42 standard to collect and retain all manner of information, thanks to a meme virus he had contracted. There was no possibility of him forgetting anything. He scratched the side of his hooked nose where his heavy augmetic eyepieces touched.
How could either of us forget that? He replied. The summer of 240, hunting the Glor clan on Gudrun during the very founding itself.
Indeed, we had played a particular role in delaying the start of the Ophidian campaign. The War Master, or Lord Militant, as he had been back then, had been all but set to launch his purge into Ophidian space when my investigation of the heretic Glor family had triggered a mass uprising, later known as the Helican Schism. To his great surprise and displeasure, the War Master had been abruptly forced to redirect his readied forces in a pacification of his very own subsector. War Master Honorius. Honorius Magnus, they were calling him. I had never met him, nor had I much wish to. A brutal man, as are so many of his kind. It takes a special mindset, a special brutality, to crush planets and populations.
There is to be a great jubilation on Thracian Primaris, Amos said. A holy novena congregated by the Synod of the High Ecclesiarchy. It is rumored that the Imperial Lord Commander Helican himself will attend, specifically to bestow upon the War Master the rank of Feudal Protector.
I'm sure he'll be very pleased. Another heavy medallion to throw at his officers when he's annoyed.
You're not tempted to attend?
I laughed. In truth, I had thought to return to the Helican subsector capital before long. Thracian Primaris, the most massive, industrialized, and populated world in the subsector, had wrested capital planet status from ancient Gudrun after the disgrace and ferment of the schism, finally achieving the preeminence it felt its size and power had long deserved. It was now the chief imperial planet of this region. There was work to be done, reports to be filed and presented, and those things could best be achieved by returning to my property on Thracian, my base of operations, near to the palace of the Inquisition. But I had little love for Thracian Primaris. It was an ugly place, and I only made my headquarters there out of convenience. The thought of pomp and ceremony and festivals filled me with quiet dread. Perhaps I would go to Messina instead, or to the quiet of Gudrun, where I maintained a small, comfortable estate.
The Inquisition is to attend in great strength. Lord Rawkin himself.
I waved a hand in Amos's direction. Does it appeal to you?
No.
Are there not better uses for our time? Pressing matters? Things that would be more easily achieved away from such overblown distractions?
Most certainly, he said.
Then I think you know my mind.
I think I do, Gregor, he said,
rising to his feet and reaching into the pocket of his green robe.
And therefore I'm fully prepared for the fact that you're going to curse me when I give you this.
He held out a small data slate, an encrypted message tile whose contents had been received and stored by the astropaths. The official seal of the Inquisition was stamped across its front. Chapter 3. Capital World. The Ocean House. Intruders, past and present. Thracian Primaris, capital world of the Helican subsector, seat of government, Helican subsector, Scarus sector, Segmentum obscurus. You can read that description in any one of 100,000 guidebooks, geographies, imperial histories, pilgrimage primers, industrial ledgers, trade directories, star maps. It sounds impressive, authoritarian, powerful. It does no justice at all to the monster it describes. I have known hellholes and death planets that from space look serene and wondrous. The watercolors of their atmospheres, the glittering moons and belts they wear like bangles and jewels, the natural wonders that belie the dangers they contain. Thracian Primaris is no such dissembler. From space it glowers like an oozing cataracted eye. It is corpulent, swollen, sheened in grey veils of atmospheric soot, through which the billion lights of the city hives glimmer like rotting stars. It glares balefully at all ships that approach. And oh, but they approach. Shoals of ships, flocks of them, countless craft drawn to this bloated cesspit by the lure of its vast industrial wealth and mercantile vigour. It has no moons, no natural moons, anyway. 5 Ramillies-class star forts hang above its atmosphere, their crenellated towers and buttressed gun stations guarding the approaches to and from the capital world. A dedicated guild of 40,000 skilled pilots exists simply to guide traffic in and out of the jostling, crowded high anchor reaches. It has a planetary defense force, a standing army of 8 million men. It has a population of 22 billion, plus another billion temporary residents and visitors. 7/10 of its surface are now covered by hive structures, including great sections of the world's original oceans. City sprawl fills and covers the seas, and the waters roll in darkness far beneath. I loathe the place. I loathe the lightless streets, the noise, the press of bodies. I loathe the stink of its recirculated air. I loathe its airborne grease filth, adhering to my clothes and skin. But fate and duty bring me back there, time and again. The encrypted inquisitorial missive had been quite clear. I, and a great number of my peers, was summoned to Thracian Primaris to attend the Holy Novena and wait upon the pleasure of the Lord Grand Master Inquisitor Ubertino Orsini. Orsini was the most senior officer of the Inquisition in the entire Helican subsector, a status that made him equal in rank and power to any Cardinal Palatine. I was not about to decline. The voyage from Lethe 11 took a month, and I brought my entire entourage back with me. We arrived just 4 days shy of the start of the novena. As a tiny pilot boat led my ship into anchor through the massed ranks of orbiting starships, I saw the dark formations of Battlefleet Scarus, suckling at a star fort as if they were its young. This was their heroic homecoming. There was a taste of victory in the air. An imperial triumph on this scale was something to be savoured, something the Ministorum could use to boost the morale of the common citizenry. "Your itinerary has been prepared," said Alain von Beig, a junior interrogator who served as my secretary. We were aboard the gun cutter, dropping towards the planet. "Oh, by whom?" He paused. Von Beig was a diffident and lustreless young man, who I doubted would ever make the rank of Inquisitor. I had accepted him to my staff in the hope that service alongside Ravener might inspire him. It had not. I would have presumed that the preparation of my itinerary might have included my own choices. Von Beig stammered something. I took the data slate he was holding. The list of appointments was not his handiwork, I saw. It was an official document, processed by the Ministorum's nunciature in collaboration with the Office of the Inquisition. My timetable for all 9 days of the Holy Novena was filled with audiences, acts of worship, feasts, presentation ceremonies, unveilings, and Ministorum rites. All 9 days, plus the days before and after. I was here, damn it. I had responded to the summons. I would not allow myself to be subjected to this round of junkets too. I took a stylus and quickly marked the events I was prepared to attend. The formal rites, the inquisitorial audience, the grand bestowment. "That's it," I said, tossing it back to him. "The rest I'm skipping." Von Beig looked uncomfortable. "You are expected at the post-apostolic conclave immediately on arrival." "Immediately on arrival," I told him sternly. "I'm going home." Home, for me, was the Ocean House, a private residence I leased in the most select quarter of Hive 70. On many hive worlds, the rich and privileged dwell in districts high up in the topmost city spires, divorced as far as possible from the dirt and crowding of the mid and low-hab levels. But no matter how high you climbed on Thracian Primaris, there was nothing to find but smog and pollution. Instead, the exclusive habitats were on the underside of the hive portions that extended out over and into the hidden seas. There was at least a tranquility here. Medea Betancourt flew the gun cutter down through the traffic-thick atmosphere, threaded her way between the tawdry domes, dingy towers, rusting masts, and crumbling spires, and laced into the seething lanes of air vehicles, entering a vast feeder tunnel which gave access to the hive's arterial transit network. Bars of blue-white light set into the walls of the huge tunnel strobed by the ports. In under an hour we had reached a great transit hub, 3 kilometers down in the city crust, where she set the cutter down on a massive elevator platform that sedately lowered us and a dozen other craft into the sublevels of Hive 70. The cutter was then berthed in a private lifterdrome, and we transferred to a tube rail for the final stretch to the maritime habitats. I was already weary of Thracian Primaris by the time I reached the Ocean House. Built from plasma-sealed grandiorite and an adamite frame, the Ocean House was one of 1,000 estates built along the submarine wall of Hive 70. It was 9 kilometers beneath the city crust, and another 2 below sea level. A small palace by the standards of most common imperial citizens, it was large enough to house my entire retinue, my libraries, armory, and training facilities, not to mention a private chapel, an audience hall, and an entire annex for Bequin's distaff. It was also secure, private, and quiet. Yarat, my housekeeper, was waiting for us in the entrance hall. She was dressed, as ever, in a pale grey gown robe and a black lace cap, draped with a white veil. As the great iron hatch doors cycled open, and I breathed the cool, purified air of the house, she clapped her plump hands and sent servitors scurrying forward to take our coats and assist with the baggage train. I stood for a moment on the Nashmeek rug and looked around at the austere stone walls and the high arched roof. There were no paintings, no busts or statuary, no crossed weapons or embroidered tapestries, only an inquisitorial crest on the far wall over the stairs. I am not one for decoration or opulence. I require simple comfort and functionality. The others bustled around me. Bequin and Amos went through to the library. Ravener and von Baig issued careful instructions to the servitors concerning some baggage items. Medea disappeared to her private room. The others in my retinue melted away into the house. Yarat greeted them all, and then came to me. "Welcome, sir," she said. "You have long been from us." 16 months, Yarat. "The house is aired and ready. We made preparations as soon as you signaled your intentions. We were saddened to hear of the losses." "Anything to report?" "Security was, of course, double-checked prior to your arrival. There are a number of messages." "I'll review them shortly." "You are hungry, no doubt." She was right, though I hadn't realized it. "The kitchen is preparing dinner. I took the liberty of selecting a menu that I believe you will approve of." "As ever, I have faith in your choices, Yarat. I'd like to dine on the sea terrace, with any who would join me." "I'll see to it, sir. Welcome home." I bathed, put on a robe of grey wool, and sat for a while alone in my private chambers, sipping a glass of amasec and looking through the messages and communiques by the soft light of the lamp. There were many, mostly recent postings from old acquaintances, officials, fellow inquisitors, soldiers, alerting me to their arrival on the planet and conveying respects. Few needed more than a form reply from my secretary. To some I penned courteous, personal responses, expressing the hope of meeting them at some or other of the Novina's many events. There were 3 that drew my particular attention. The first was a private coded missive from Lord Inquisitor Phlebas Alessandro Raucan. Raucan was the head of Ordo Xenos in the Helican subsector, my immediate superior and part of the triumvirate of senior inquisitors who answered directly to Grandmaster Orsini. Raucan wanted to see me as soon as I was back on Thracian. I responded immediately that I would come to him at the Palace of the Inquisition the following morning. The second was from my old friend and colleague Titus Endor. It had been a long time since I had set eyes on him. His message, uncoded, read, Gregor, my greetings to you. Are you home? The brevity was disarming. I sent an affirmative response that was similarly brief. Endor clearly did not want to converse in writing. I awaited his response. The third was also uncoded, or at least lacked electronic encryption. It said in Glossia, "Scalpel cuts quickly, eager tongues revealed. At Cadia, by terse. Hound wishes thorn. Thorn should be sharp." The sea terrace was probably the main reason I had leased the Ocean House in the first place. It was a long ceramite-vaulted hall with one entire wall made of armoured glass looking into the ocean. The industrialization of Thracian Primaris had killed off a great part of the world's sea life, but at these depths, hardy survivors such as luminous deep anglers and schools of incandescent jellies could still be glimpsed in the emerald nocturnal glow. The candle-lit room was washed by a rippling green half-light. Yarat's servitors had set the long table for 9, and those 9 were already taking their seats and chatting over preprandial drinks as I arrived. Like most of them, I had dressed informally, putting on a simple black suit. The kitchen provided steamed fubi dumplings and grilled kettlefish, followed by seared haunches of rare, gamey orkunu, and then pear and berry tarts with a cinnamon jus. A sturdy Gudrunite claret and sweet dessert wine from the vineyards of Messina complemented the food perfectly. I had forgotten the excellent qualities of the house Yarat ran for me, so far away from the hardship of missions in the field. Around the table with me were Amos, Bequin, Ravener, von Beg, my rubricator and scribe Aldemar Sulis, Eubal Kirscher, the head of household security, a trusted field agent called Harlon Nail, and Thula Surskova, who was Bequin's chief aide with the distaff. Medea Betancourt had chosen not to join us, but I knew the intensity of the piloting chores down through Thracian airspace had undoubtedly worn her out. I was pleased to see that Ravener was present. His injuries were healing, the physical ones at least, and though he was quiet and a little withdrawn, I felt he was beginning to come through the shock of Arianod's death. Surskova, a short, ample woman in her 40s, was quietly briefing Bequin on the progress of the newer distaff initiates. Amos chunted on to Sulis and Nail about the events on Lethe 11, and they listened intently. Sulis, enfeebled and prematurely aged by a wasting disease, never left the Ocean House, and devoted his life to the maintenance and preservation of my extensive private libraries. If Amos hadn't related the story of our last mission to him, I would have made sure I did. Such tales were his only connection to the active process of our business, and he loved to hear them. Nail, an ex-bounty hunter from Loki, had been injured on a mission the year before, and had not been able to join us for the Lethe endeavour. He too lapped up Amos's account, asking occasional questions. I could tell he was itching to get back to work. Von Beg and Kirscher chatted idly about the preparations for the novena that was now gripping the hives of Thracian, and the security consequences they brought. Kirscher was an able man, ex-Arbites, and dependable, if a little unimaginative. As dessert was served, the discussion broadened across the table.
"They say the bestowment will be the making of the War Master,"
Nail said, his loaded spoon poised in front of his mouth. "He's made already, I'd say," I retorted.
"Nail's right, Gregor. I heard that too,"
said Ravener.
"Feudal protector. That's as good as Imperial Lord Commander Helican admitting the War Master is on an equal footing with him. It's a sinecure." "Not at all. It makes Honorius the favourite to become War Master-in-Chief in the Akratara Theatre, now that War Master Hidju is dead, and Hidju was being groomed for a place on the Senatorium Imperialis, perhaps even to sit amongst the High Lords of Terra." "Honorius may be Magnus, but he's not High Lord material," I ventured. "After this, he might be,"
said Nail.
"Lord Commander Helican must think he has potential, or he wouldn't be giving him such an almighty hand up."
Politics left me cold, and I seldom empathized with political ambitions. I only studied the subject because my duties often demanded a detailed working knowledge. Imperial Lord Commander Helican, which is to say Jeromir Faulitz IV of the noble imperial family Faulitz, was the supreme secular authority in the Helican subsector, for which reason he styled himself with the subsector's name in his appellation. On paper, even the cardinals of the Ministorum, the Grand Master of the Inquisition, the senior luminaries of the Administratum, and the Lords Militant had to answer to him, though, as with all things in imperial society, it was never as easy as that. Church, state, and military, woven together as one, yet constantly inimical. In favouring War Master Honorius with the bestowment, Lord Helicon was throwing his lot in with the military, an overt signal to the other organs of government, and clearly expected the War Master to return the favour when he rose to levels of government beyond those of a single subsector. It was a dangerous game, and rare for so senior an official to play openly for such an advantage, though the battle glory that surrounded Honorius made a perfect excuse. And that made it a dangerous time. Somebody would want to redress that balance. My money would be on the ecclesiarchy, though it's fair to say I'm biased. However, history has shown the Church to be chronically intolerant of losing power to the military or the state. I said as much.
There are many other elements,
Amos chuckled, accepting a refill of dessert wine.
The Fowlit's line is weak, and lacks both support in the Adeptus Terra and a ready ear at the Senatorum Imperialis and the courts of the Golden Throne. Two powerful families, the De Venzi and the Fulvatori, are seeking to make gains against the Fowlits, and would take this as an open show of defiance. Then there's the House of Erstfald, who see their own famous son, Lord Militant Strephon, as the only viable replacement for Hidju. And the Augustin dynasty, let's not forget, who were ousted from power when the High Lord of Terra, Gian Augustin, died in office 40 years ago. They've been trying to get back in with feverish determination these last few years, pushing their candidate, Lord Commander Cosimo, with almost unseemly impudence. If Nail's right, and the bestowment makes Honorius a certainty as Hidju's successor, he'd become a direct competitor with Cosimo for the High Lord's vacant position. Down the table, Beckwin yawned and caught my eye.
Cosimo's never going to make it,
Sullus put in candidly.
His house is far too unpopular with the Adeptus Mechanicus, and without their consent, however tacit, no one ever makes it to High Lord rank. Besides, the Ministorum would block it. Gian Augustin made no friends there with his reforms. They say it was a Calidus of the Officio Assassinorum, under orders from the ecclesiarchy, that took old Gian off, not a stroke at all.
Careful what you say, old friend, or they'll be sending one after you, Ravenna said. Sullus held up his bony hands in a dismissive gesture as laughter rippled around the table.
It is still most perturbatory, Amos said. This bestowment could lead to a house war. Quite apart from all the obvious opponents, Lord Helicon and the War Master could find themselves tasked by imperial families who are thus far neutral. There are many who are quite comfortable with their situation, and who would strike with astonishing ruthlessness simply to avoid being drawn into an open bloody clash.
There was silence for a moment. Sullus, said Ravenna quickly, changing the subject with a diplomat's deftness. I have a number of works for you that I collected on Lethe, including a palimpsest of the Analecta phenomena. Sullus engaged the young interrogator eagerly. Amos, von Beig, and Nail continued to debate the imperial intrigue. Beckwin and Sir Scova made their good nights and withdrew. I took my crystal balloon of Amasek to the glass wall and looked out into the oceanic depths. Kirscher joined me after a moment. He smoothed the front of his navy blue jacket and put on his black gloves before speaking. We had intruders last month, he said quietly. I looked round at him. When? 3 times, in fact, he said, though I didn't realize that until the 3rd occasion. During night cycle, about 6 weeks ago, I had what seemed to be a persistent fault on the alarms covering the seawall vents. There was no further sign, and the servitors replaced that section of the system. Then again, a week later, on the service entrance to the food stores and the outer doors of the distaff annex, both on the same night. I suspected a system corruption and planned an overhaul of the entire alarm net. The following week, I found the security code on the outer locks of the main door had been defaulted to 0. Someone had been in and left again. I scoured the building and found vox thieves buried in the walls of 6 rooms, including your inner chambers, and discrete file coders wired into 3 communication junction nodes, spliced to vox and pict lines. Someone had also tried, and failed, to force their way into your void vault, but they didn't know the shield codes. And there were no traces. No prints, no microspores, no follicles. I washed the air myself, through the particle scrubber. The in-house picked recorders show nothing, except a beautifully disguised time jump of 34 seconds. The astropaths sensed nothing. In one place, the intruder must have walked across 4 meters of underfloor pressure pads without setting them off. In retrospect, I realized the 2 prior incidents, far from being system faults, were experimental tests to probe, gauge, and estimate our security net. Trial runs before the actual intrusion. For that, they used a code scrambler on the main doors. If they'd actually been able to crack it, they could have reset the code, and I'd never have known they'd been in. You've double-checked everything? No more bugs to be found? He shook his head. Lord, I can only apologize. I held up a hand. No need, Kirscher. You've done your job. Show me what they left. Kirscher unrolled a red felt cloth across the top of a table in the quiet of the inner library. He was nervous, and beads of sweat were trickling down from his crest-like shock of white hair. I hadn't wanted to alarm anyone, so I'd asked only Ravener and Amos to join us. The room smelled of teak from the shelves, must from the books, and ozone from the suspension field sustaining especially frail manuscripts. The felt was laid out. On it lay 9 tiny devices, 6 Vox thieves and 3 far-coders, each one set in a pearl of solid plastic. Once I'd stripped them out, I sealed them in inert gel to make sure they were dead. None were booby-trapped. Gideon Ravener stepped in and picked up one of the sealed Vox thieves, holding it up in the light.
Imperial, he said. Unmarked, but Imperial. Very high grade and advanced.
I thought so too, said Kirscher. Military? Secular? I asked.
Ravener shrugged. We could source them to likely manufacturers, but they likely supply all arms of the Imperium.
Amos's augmetic optics clicked and turned as he peered down at the objects on the cloth.
The far-coders, he began, similarly advanced. It takes singular skill to patch one of these successfully into a comm node.
It takes singular skill to break in like they did, I countered.
They have no maker markings, but they're clearly refined models from the Amplox series. Much more refined than the heavy-duty units the military use. It's just conjecture, but I'd say this was beyond the Ministorum, too. They're notoriously behind when it comes to tech advancements.
Who, then? I asked.
The Adeptus Mechanicus?
He ventured. I scowled. He shrugged, smiling.
Or at least a body with the power and influence to secure such advanced devices from the Adeptus Mechanicus.
Like?
The Officio Assassinorum?
Who would break in to kill, not listen.
Noted. Then a powerful imperial house, one with clout in the Senatorum Imperialis.
Possible, I admitted.
Or, he said.
Or?
Or the one imperial institution that regularly employs such devices and has the prestige and determination to make sure it is using the best available equipment.
That being? Amos looked at me as if I was stupid.
The Inquisition, of course.
I slept badly, fitfully. 3 hours before the end of the night cycle, I sat up in my bed, suddenly coldly awake. Dressed only in the sheet I had wrapped around me, I stalked out into the hall, my grip firm on the matte grey snub pistol that lived in a holster secured behind my headboard. Dim blue light filtered through the hallway, softening the edges of everything. I crept forward. I was not mistaken. Someone was moving about down below, in the lower foyer. I edged down the stairs, gun braced, willing my eyes to accustomize to the gloom. I thought to hit a Vox and alert Kirscher and his staff. But if someone was inside, skillful enough to get past the alarms, then I wanted to capture him, not scare him off with a full-blown alert. In the few hours since I had arrived back at the Ocean House, a nasty taste of treachery had seeped into my world. It might be largely paranoia, but I wanted an end to it. A beam of white light stabbed across the foyer floor from the half-open kitchen doors. I heard movement again. I sidled to the door frame, checked the safety was off, and slid, weapon first, through the gap in the doors. The outer kitchen, a realm of marble-topped work bays and scrubbed aluminium ranges, was empty. Metal pots and utensils hung silently from ceiling racks. There was a smell of garlic and cooked herbs in the still air. The light was on in the inner pantry, near the cold store, and the illuminated backwash filled the room. 2 steps. 3. 4. The kitchen stone floor was numbingly cold under my bare feet. I reached the door to the inner pantry. There was movement inside. I kicked the door open and leapt inside, aiming the compact sidearm. Medea Betancourt, clad only in a long ex-military undershirt, roared out in surprise and dropped the tray of leftover kettlefish she had been gorging on. The tray clattered on the tiled floor in front of the open larder.
"Great gods alive, Eisenhorn!"
she wailed in outrage, jumping up and down on the spot.
"Don't do that!"
I was angry. I didn't immediately lower my aim. "What are you doing?"
"Eating. Hello?"
She sneered at me.
"Feel like I've been asleep for a week. I'm famished."
I began to lower the gun. A sense of embarrassment began to filter into my wired state. "I'm sorry. Sorry. You should maybe get dressed before you come down to raid the larder." It sounded stupid even as I said it. I didn't realize how stupid until a moment later. I was too painfully aware of her long, dark legs and the way the singlet top was curved around the proud swell of her bust.
"You should take your own advice,
Gregor," she said, raising one eyebrow. I looked down. I had lost the sheet, kicking open the door. I was what Midas Betancourt used to call very naked. Except, of course, for the loaded gun. Damn. My apologies. I turned to scrabble for the fallen sheet.
"Don't stand on my account,"
she sniggered. I froze, stooped. The muzzle of a transverse parabellum was pointing directly at my head from the darkness behind me. It lowered. Harlan Nail looked me up and down for a moment in frank dismay, and then raised a warning finger to his lips. He was fully clothed. Damn him. I retrieved my sheet.
"What?"
I hissed.
"Someone's in. I can feel it,"
he whispered.
"The noise you two were making. I thought it was the intruder. Didn't know you were so keen on Medea."
Shut up. The two of us fanned out back through the outer kitchen. Nail pulled up the hood of his vulcanized black body glove to cover his pale, shaved head. He was a big man, a head taller than me, but he melted away into the darkness. I watched carefully for his signals. Nail waved me left down the hall. I trusted his judgment completely. He had stalked the galaxy's most innovative and able scum for 3 decades. If they were intruders, he'd find them. I entered the Ocean House's main hall and saw the front entry was ajar. The code display on the main lock was blinking a default of 0s. I swung round as a gun roared behind me. I heard Nail cry out and sprinted back into the inner foyer. Nail was on the floor, grappling with an unidentified man. "Get up! Get up! I'm armed!" I shouted. In reply, the unknown intruder smacked Nail's head back against the floor so hard he knocked him out, and then threw Nail's heavy sidearm at me. I fired once and blew a hole in the wall. The spinning gun clipped my temple and knocked me over. I heard a series of fleshy cracks and impacts, a guttural gasp, and then Medea Betancourt's voice shouting, "Lights up!" I rose. She was standing astride the intruder, one hand braced in a fierce fist, the other pulling down her undershirt for modesty. "I got him," she said, glancing round at me. The dazed intruder was clad in black from head to foot. I wrenched off his hood. It was Titus Endor. "Gregor," he lisped through a bloody mouth. "You did say you were home?" Chapter 4. Between Friends. An interview with Lord Rawkin. The Apotropaic Congress. Grange Leak with shaved ice and a sliver of citrus. Seated in my sanctum chamber, Endor took the proffered drink and grinned at me. "You remembered." "Many were the nights in those fine old days. Titus, I've mixed your drink of choice too many times to count." "Ha! I know. What was that place, the one off Zansipal Street, where the host used to drink the profits?" "The Thirsty Eagle," I replied. He knew full well. It was as if he was testing me. The thirsty eagle, that's it. Many were the nights, as you say. He held up his tumbler of clear, iced spirits. Raise 'em and sink 'em, and let's have another. I echoed the old toast and clinked my lead crystal of vintage Amasec against his glass. For a moment it was indeed like the fine old days. Both of us, 19 years old, full of piss and promethium, newly promoted interrogators ready to take on the whole damn galaxy, students of old Inquisitor Hapshant. 5 years later, almost simultaneously, we would both be elected full Inquisitors, and our individual careers would begin in earnest. 19 years old, drunk on our feet, carousing in an armpit of a bar off Zansipal Street after hours, mocking our illustrious mentor and bonding for life, bonding with that unquestioning exuberance that seems to me now only possible in youth. It was like regarding a different life, so far away, almost unrecoverable. I was not that Gregor Eisenhorn. And this man, with his long braided grey hair and scarred face, sitting in my sanctum, dressed in a body-heat masking stealth suit, was not that Titus Endor. You could have called, I began. I did. I shrugged. You could have joined us for dinner tonight. Yarat excelled herself again. I know, but then... He paused and rattled the ice around in his drink thoughtfully. But then it might have become known that Inquisitor Endor had visited Inquisitor Eisenhorn. It is well known that those two are old friends. Why would that have been a problem? Endor set down his drink, unpopped the fasteners around his waistband, and pulled the top half of his stealth suit up over his head. He cast the garment aside. Too hot, he remarked. His undershirt was dark with sweat. The jagged sour-wrapped tooth still hung around his neck on a black cord. That tooth. Years ago, I dug it out of his leg after he had driven the beast off. Brontotaff. 12 decades ago, and more. The pair of us, alongside Hapshant, in the Mistmeres. I've come for the Novena, he said. I was summoned to attend by Orsini's staff. Like you, I imagine. I wanted to talk to you. Talk to you as far off the record as was possible. So you broke into my house? He sighed deeply, finished his drink, and walked over to the spirit stand in the corner of the room to fix another. You're in trouble, he said. Really? Why is that? He looked round, peeling strips of citrus rind off a fruit with a paring knife. I don't know. But there are rumblings. There are always rumblings. He turned to face me fully. His eyes were suddenly very hard and bright. Take this seriously. Very well, I will. You know what the rumour mill is like. Someone's always got a point to make, a score to settle. There were stories. I dismissed them at first. Stories? He sighed again and returned to his seat with his refreshed drink. There is talk that you are unsound. What talk? Damn it, Gregor. I'm not one of your interview suspects. I've come here as a friend. A friend who broke in wearing a stealth suit and... Shut up just for a minute, would you? I paused. Gladly, if you cut to the chase. The first I heard, someone was bad-mouthing you. Who? It doesn't matter. I waded in and told them just what I thought. Then I heard the story again. Eisenhorn's unsound. He's lost the plot. Really? Then the stories changed. It was no longer Eisenhorn's unsound. It was the people who matter think Eisenhorn's unsound. As if somehow suspicion of you had become official. I've heard nothing, I said, sitting back. Of course you haven't. Who'd say it to your face but a friend, or a convening judge from internal prosecution? I raised my eyebrows. You're really worried, aren't you, Titus? Damn right. Someone's gunning for you. Someone who's got the ear of the upper echelon. Your career and activities are under scrutiny. You get all that from rumours? Come on, Titus. There are plenty of Inquisitors I can think of who'd like to score points off me. Orsini's a closet monodominant, and the Puritan idealists are forming a power block around him. They are radicals in their way. You know that. Us Amalathians are too loose for their tastes. I mentioned before how I hated politics. Nothing is more fruitless and wearying than the internal politics of the Inquisition itself. My kind is fractured internally by belief factions and intellectual sectarianism. Endor and myself count ourselves as Amalathian Inquisitors, which is to say we hold an optimistic outlook and work to sustain the integrity of the Imperium, believing it to be functioning according to the Divine Emperor's scheme. We preserve the status quo. We hunt down recidivist elements, heretics, aliens, psychers, the three key enemies of mankind. These are, of course, our primary targets, but we will set ourselves against anything that we perceive to be destabilizing imperial society, up to and including factional infighting between the august organs of our culture. It has always struck me as ironic that we had to become a faction in order to fight factionalism. We profess to be Puritans, and certainly are so compared to the extreme radical factions of the Inquisition, such as the Istvanians and the Recongrinators. But equally alien to us are the extreme right wing of the Puritan factions, the Monodominants and the Thorians, some of whom believe even the use of trained psychers to be heretical. If I was in trouble, it would not be the first time an Inquisitor of tempered, moderate beliefs had run foul of either extreme in his own organization. "This goes beyond simple faction intrigue," Titus said quietly. "This isn't a hard-liner deciding to give the moderates a going-over. This is particular to you. They have something." "What?" "Something concrete on you." "How do you know?" "Because 20 days ago, on Messina, I was detained and questioned by Inquisitor Osmar of the Ordo Malleus." I suddenly realized I was up out of my seat. "You were what?" He waved dismissively. "I'd just finished a waste-of-time matter and was preparing to pack up and ship for Thracian. Osmar contacted me, polite and friendly, and asked if he could meet with me. I went to see him. It was all very civil. He made no effort to restrain me, but I don't think I could have left before he had finished. He was guarded, but he made it clear that if I decided to walk out, his people would stop me." "That's outrageous." "No, that's Osmar. You've met him, surely. One of Orsini's, Bezier's right-hand man, Thorian to the marrow. He makes a point of getting what he's after." "And what did he get?" "From me?" Endor laughed. "Not a thing, except for a glowing character reference. He allowed me to leave after an hour. The bastard even suggested we might meet and dine together, socially, during the novena. Osmar is a skilled operator, slippery. So, that begs the question, what did he want?" "He wanted you. He was interested in our friendship and our history. He asked me about you, like he wanted me to let something personal and damning slip. He didn't give away much of anything, but it was clear he had dirt. Some report had been filed that compromised you, directly or indirectly. By the end of it, I knew that the rumors I had been hearing were just the surface ripples of a secret inquiry. I knew then that I had to warn you, without anyone knowing we'd spoken." "It's all lies," I told him. "What is?" "I don't know. Whatever they think. Whatever they fear. I've done nothing that deserves the attention of the Ordo Malleus." "I believe you, Gregor," Endor said, in a way that suggested to me he undoubtedly did not. We took fresh drinks onto the sea terrace. He looked out at the kaleidoscopic swirls of luminous plankton and said, "They've only just begun." I nodded and looked down at the drink cradled in my hands. "On Lethe, Tantalid came after me. I supposed at the time it was old scores, but from what you've said tonight, I doubt that now." "Be careful," he murmured. "Look, Gregor, I should go. This should have been a better reunion of old friends." "I want to thank you for the chance you took, the effort you made to bring this to me." "You'd do the same." "I would. One last thing. How did you get in?" He looked round at me sharply. "What?" "In here, tonight." "I used a code scrambler on the door." "You diverted the alarms?" "I'm not a novice, Gregor. My scrambler was set to trigger a nulling cascade effect through the system." "That's quite a piece of kit. May I see it?" He took a small black pad from his hip pocket and passed it to me. "An Amplox model," I noted. "Quite advanced." "I only use the best." "Me too. I've employed these before." They seem, just in my experience, to work best after a few tests.
How so?
A dry run or two, I mean. To assess the system you're trying to penetrate. A few soft passes to gauge the security and let the scrambler assimilate and learn what it's up against. Yeah, I've done that, when I've had the luxury of time. These suckers learn fast. Still, they do the job on the spot when time is tight. Like tonight, I handed the device back to him. Yes. What do you mean? It got you in tonight? From cold? No test runs necessary? No, of course not. This visit was spur of the moment. And until that pretty bitch of yours kicked me in the face, I had thought myself very lucky to have gotten so far. And so you haven't been here before? You haven't been in before? No, he said sharply. Either I had offended him or... Go, if you have to, I said. Good night, Gregor. Good night, Titus. I'd offer to show you out, but I think you know the way well enough. He grinned, raised his glass, and finished it in a single swig. Raise 'em and sink 'em, and let's have another. I hope so, I replied. The palace of the Inquisition on Thracian Primaris is high in the cloud tiers of Hive 44. The size of a small city itself, it is the chief office of the Inquisition in the Helican subsector, maintaining a permanent staff of 60,000. I make no excuses for its black statite facings, its darkened windows, its protective spines of iron spikes. Critics of the Inquisition may regard its architecture as almost comically overdone, playing directly to the general public's worst fears about the nature of the Inquisition with its deliberate black menace. That, I would say, is precisely the point. Fear keeps the populace in line, fear of an institution so terrible it will not hesitate to punish them for transgressions. At the start of the next day cycle, I went to the palace, escorted by Amos, Van Beeg, and Thula Serskova. Ironically, I felt vulnerable with only 3 companions at my side. I had grown too used to a large retinue these last few decades. I had to remind myself that there had been a time when my entire retinue would have numbered 3 such people. The Palace of the Inquisition is not a place for casual or accidental meetings. Inside it is a dark maze of shadowy halls, void screens, and opaquing fields. The staff and visitors move privately behind masking energy fields, their business confidential. On entry to the echoing main hall, my party was issued with a drone cyberskull that hovered at our shoulders and projected an insulating cone of silence around us. We were offered an astropath ep2 to further ensure our privacy, but I declined. Serskova, with her untouchable quality, was all I needed. The hooded inquisitorial guards, their burgundy armor threaded with gold leaf and emblazoned with the seal of our office, led us across the black marble floor, their double-handed power blades held upright before them. Glinting brown opaquing fields swirled into being on either side, forming a solid, buzzing corridor of energy that divorced us from our surroundings. Alain von Beeg played with his high collar distractedly as we walked. He was nervous. The oppressive threat of the palace affected even its own servants. Lord Rorken awaited us in his private chambers. A void shield dissipated to allow us through the circular doorway and flickered back to life once we were inside. The guards did not accompany us. I told my trio to wait for me in the austere vestibule, where there were 2 cast-iron benches piled with white satin bolsters. I went in through the inner door. I had come wearing black, with a 3/4 cloak of dark brown leather. My inquisitorial crest was pinned at my throat. My companions were all formally robed too. One did not call on the master of Ordo Xenos in casual attire. The reception chamber was dazzlingly bright. The walls were mirrors, framed in ormolu gilt, and the floor was a polished cream marble. Thousands of candles burned all around, on stands, on forked candelabras, or simply placed directly on the floor. The mirrors reflected their glare. It was like standing in a prism that was catching golden sunlight. I blinked and raised my hand to shield my eyes. I saw 100 other men in cloaks do the same. My reflections. Multiplied Gregor Eisenhorns, framed by twinkling candles. I saw I looked edgy. That would not do.
None may escape the penetrating glare of the Inquisition's light,
said a voice. For to do so means perforce they embrace the outer darkness, I finished. Rawkin strode towards me. You know your Cataldinus, Eisenhorn. His apothegms please me. I have never much liked his later allegories. Too dry, too arch, too mannered. For my taste, Thracian has a superior voice. Less bombastic. Rawkin smiled and took my hand. So, you rate poetic beauty over content. Beauty is truth, and truth beauty. He raised an eyebrow. What is that? A pre-imperial fragment I once read. Anonymous. As to your first question, I would read Thracian over Cataldinus for pleasure, and insist that my neophytes read Cataldinus repeatedly until they can quote it as well as I. Rawkin nodded. He was a compact man, his head shaved but for a short goatee, and he wore crimson robes over black clothes and gloves. It was impossible to guess his age, but he must have been at least 300 years old, for he had held his high office for a century and a half. Thanks to augmentation and juvenatus processes, he looked like a man in his late 40s. "Can I offer you refreshment?" he asked. "Thank you, no, sir. The Nunciature has organized a busy schedule for me through the novena, so I would be grateful if we could deal with things directly." "The Ministerum's nuncios have set busy schedules for us all. The Lord Commander has charged them with arranging as much pomp as possible for this celebration, and the Gregor Eisenhorn I know won't be sticking to their appointments if he can help it." I made no reply. That was a telling remark. I became wary. Rawkin and I had a good working relationship, and I felt he had trusted me ever since the affair with the Necrochuk 98 years before. Since then he had been pleased to lead me, guide me, and oversee my cases personally. But one did not become anything like friends with the master of the Ordo Xenos Helicon. "Have a seat. You could spare me a little time, I think." We sat on high-backed chairs either side of a low table, and he gave me chilled water imported from the Calabite springs of Gidmos. "A restorative tonic. I understand the Beldame tested you hard on Lethe 11. I slid a data slate out of my cloak. "A preliminary draft of my full report," I said, handing it to him. He took it and put it unread on the table. "Do you know why I've asked to see you?" I paused and took a calculated gamble. "Because of the stories that I am unsound?" He cocked his head in interest. "You've heard them?" "They've been brought to my attention. Recently." "Your reaction?" "In all honesty?" "Puzzlement. I don't know the matter of the stories themselves. I feel someone must have a grudge." "Against you?" "Against me. Personally." He sipped his water. "Before we go any further, I must ask you, is there any reason at all, that you think this story has arisen?" "As I said, the grudge is the—" "No," he said quietly. "You know what I'm asking you." "I've done nothing," I said. "I'll take your word for that. If at a later time I discover you're lying, or even hiding something from me, I will be displeased." "I have done nothing," I repeated. He steepled his hands and looked out across the sea of candles. "Here is the way of it. An inquisitor, who, it does not matter, reported to me in confidence a disturbing encounter. A demon host made a show of sparing a man's life because it thought he was you." I was fascinated and horrified at the thought. "I am not able to confirm it, but the demon host has been identified as Cherubael." Now my blood ran cold. Cherubael. "You've had no contact with that entity since 56 Izar?" I shook my head. "No, sir. And that was almost a century ago." "But you've been looking for it ever since?" "I've made no secret of that, sir. Cherubael is the agency of an invisible enemy, one whose machinations involved even a member of our office." "Molitor?" "Yes. Conrad Molitor. I have spent a great deal of time and effort trying to uncover the truth about Cherubael and its unseen master, but it has been fruitless. 10 decades and only the barest few hints." "The matter of Cherubael's involvement in the Necrochuk affair was passed to the Ordo Malleus, as you know. They too have failed to turn up a trace of it. Where was this alleged encounter? He paused. Vogel Passionata? And it thought it was sparing me. The implication was the demon host had better things in mind for you. There was a strong suggestion of a compact between you and it. Nonsense. I hope so. Really? Nonsense, sir. I hope so, Eisenhorn. Grandmaster Orsini has no time for radical elements in the Inquisition. Even if he wasn't so hard-line, I'd not stand for it. Ordo Xenos Helican has no place for those who consort with chaos. I understand. Make sure you do. Rawkin's face was dark and stern now. Your search for this entity continues. Even now I have agents in the field hunting for it. With any signs of success? I thought of the Glossier-coded message I had received the night before. No, I said, my first and only lie in the conversation. The Inquisitor in question urged me to take the matter to the Ordo Malleus. I'll not throw one of my best men to the mercy of Bezier's dogs. I kept the matter internal to our Ordo. Then why the stories? That's what troubled me, too. Word has got out anyway. I thought it prudent to advise you that the Ordo Malleus might be scrutinizing you. A second warning in 12 hours. I'd like to suggest you leave Thracian and get on with other work until the matter blows over, he said. But your presence is required for the Apotropaic Congress. Pieces now fell into place. The sheer scale of the triumph celebrations, the magnitude of the novena, were appropriate enough, but the number of senior inquisitors summoned to attend was heavy-handed, to say the least. Military and ecclesiarch luminaries may be ordered around to swell such events, but inquisitors are a different breed, more aloof, more independent. It is unusual for us to be called together in any great gathering, particularly by such incontestable orders. I had presumed Orsini was throwing his weight around to impress the Lord Commander Helican. But that was not the case. There was to be an apotropaic congress. That is why we had been called here. Apotropaic studies are conducted all the time by the Inquisition, and usually involve one or perhaps as many as 3 inquisitors. On a larger scale, they are named councils, and require a quorum of at least 11 inquisitors. Larger than that, they become a congress. Such assemblies are extremely rare. I knew for a fact that my late master Hapshant had served on the last such congress held in the subsector. That was 279 years in the past. The purpose of these studies, even at their smallest level, is the acute examination and assessment of unusually valuable captives. Once in the custody of the Inquisition, a rogue psyker, a charismatic heretic, an alien warlord, whatever, undergoes a sometimes lengthy formal examination quite separate from the dissection of his or her actual crimes. They are often already condemned and only waiting for sentence to be carried out. At that stage, the Inquisition wishes to expand its own learning, to understand more precisely the nature of the enemies of mankind. The subjects are dissected, usually intellectually, sometimes psychically, and occasionally literally, in order to discover their strengths, weaknesses, beliefs, and drives. Vital truths have in this way been discovered by apotropaic councils, truths that have armored the servants of the Imperium for later clashes. To illustrate, the Imperial Guard's famous victory over the Ezel metabreed was only successful thanks to methods of detecting their presence discovered by the examination of an Ezel scout form by the Apotropaic Council of Ademus Ultima in 883.M40. The size of the inquiry depends on the number or magnitude of the subject. 33 heretic psychers of level Alpha or above were captured by the War Master at Dulcine during the final major engagement of the Ophidian suppression, Rawkin told me, showing me a data slate. The security clearance on the slate was so high that even I was impressed. Trained somehow to control and master the warp-spawned filth they channel, they formed the backbone of the enemy's high command defense, the beating heart of the adversary. How were they taken? Alive, I mean. It was astonishing. Untrained psychers are terrifying enough, their minds always carrying the horrendous potential to open up a gate into the immaterium, to let its demons flood through into our universe. But these These fiends, they had somehow learnt or been trained to focus their warp-spawned talents, to contain the demons within themselves and use their damnable strength. My mind reeled at the threat they had posed, and posed still, though they were our prisoners. Rawkin gestured to the slate in my hands.
You'll find a summary of the incident there, appended to the main list. In brief, it was luck. Luck and the amazing courage of the Adeptus Astartes, working in conjunction with Inquisitors Haldane, Lyco, and Voke.
Voke. Commodus Voke.
I forgot. You're old friends, aren't you? He was involved with the Glor affair on Gudrun, just before the schism.
Old friends is probably pushing it. We worked together. We generated a mutual respect. I've seen him infrequently since then. I'm amazed the old dog is still alive.
Alive, despite the prognoses of several generations of Medicae experts, and still powerful. To achieve this in his twilight years.
I nodded. Even a speed reading of the incident suggested an act of near mythical valor. Voke's service to the Emperor was, as ever, above and beyond any reasonable expectation of duty. I know Haldane, too. He was Voke's pupil. So he's finally made it to Inquisitor rank, too.
For 60 years now. Eisenhorn. You lead a solitary life, don't you?
If you mean I don't keep up with the comings and goings of elections and the businesses of other Inquisitors, sir, yes, I do. I focus on my work and the needs of my staff. He smiled, as if indulging me. In truth, my attitude was not uncommon. As I have said, we of the Inquisition are an aloof, independent kind, and have little interest in the affairs of our colleagues. I saw another difference between myself and Rawkin. Whatever my seniority, I was still an agent of the field, a worker, an achiever, who might be gone into the distant gulfs of the halo stars for months or even years at a time. His rank tied him to his palace, and wrapped him in the intrigues and mechanisms of the imperial ruling classes in general, and the Inquisition in particular. I remembered Commodus Voke as a poisonous old viper, but a determined ally. During the affair of the Necrochuk, believing himself to be on his deathbed, he had implored me to stand reference for his pupil Haldane. I had promised him that, though when Voke then proceeded to stay alive, I had never followed it through. He had been around to see that Haldane got his rosette. Haldane. I had never liked him at all. I had never met Lyco, the third member of the glorious trio, but I knew him by reputation as an Inquisitor whose star was very much in the ascendant. Their spectacular achievement on Dulcine would further all their careers magnificently. I read through the list of Inquisitors summoned to form the council, a list which included my name. There were 60 in all. Titus Endor was amongst them. So was Ozma, and so was Bezier. Some names, like Shongard, Hand, and Riker, leapt out as men I had little wish to be in the same room with. Others, Endor, naturally, and Shiloh, Defay, and Cuvier, were individuals it would be a pleasure to see again. Some names I'd barely heard of, or never heard of at all. Others were famous or infamous Inquisitors, who I knew only by reputation. It was quite an assembly, drawn from all over the sector. "My inclusion on this list," I began,
"is no surprise. You are a senior and respected member of our office."
"Thank you, sir. But I wonder, did Voke request me personally?"
"He was going to," Rawkin told me, "but you had already been nominated."
"By whom?"
"Inquisitor Ozma," he replied.
Chapter 5. The Triumph. At the Spatian Gate. The line breaks. For all my condemnations of the overzealous pageantry of the novena, I will admit that the great triumph of the first day filled me with a sense of pride and exhilaration. Across Hive Primaris, the largest and most powerful hive on Thracian, dawn brought a chorus of klaxons and a cacophony of bells. Ministorum services, relayed live from the monument of the Ecclesiarch, were broadcast on every crackling Pict channel and public vox service. The phlegmy intonations of Cardinal Palatine Andarusius rolled across the street levels of the great hive city, overlapping like some gigantic choral round, due to the echoes of Doppler distortion. Civilians and pilgrims flooded into the streets of Hive Primaris in their millions, clogging the arterial routes and feeder tunnels and blackening the sky with their craft. Many were turned back to surrounding hives to watch the proceedings on vast hololithic screens raised in stadiums and amphitheatres for the event. The Arbiti struggled to control the flow of people and keep the route of the triumph clear. The day cycle began brightly. In the night, flocks of dirigibles from the Officium Meteorologicus had seeded the smog fields and upper cloud levels with carbon black and other chemical precipitants. Before dawn, 1,600-kilometre-wide rainstorms had washed the clouds away and drenched the primary hives, sluicing the dirt and grime away. For the first time in decades, the sky was clear. Not blue exactly, but clear of yellow pollution banks. The sun's light permeated the atmosphere, and the steepled ridges and high towers of the hives glowed. I had heard, from informal sources, that this radical act of weather control would have profound ill consequences for the planet's already brutalized climate for decades to come. Reactive hurricane storms were expected in the southern regions before the week was out, and the drainage system of the primary hives was said to be choked to bursting by the singular rainfall. It was also said that the seas would die quicker, thanks to the overdose of pollutants hosed into them so suddenly by the rain clearance. But the Lord Commander Helican had insisted that the sun shone on his victory parade. I arrived early to take my place, fearing the great flow of traffic into the hive. I brought Ravenor with me. We were both dressed in our finest garb, emblems proudly displayed, and wore ceremonial weapons. Medea Betancourt flew us in, and landed us at a reserved Navy air station just south of the Imperial armor depot. By the time she'd got us on the ground, the air routes were so thick she had no choice but to stay put there for the day. There was no flying out. She bade us a good day and strolled away across the pad to chat with the ground crew servicing a marauder. A private car, arranged by the Nunciature, took Ravenor and myself to the hive's old founding fields at Lempanor Avenue, where the Inquisition was expected to gather to join the march. Outside the windows of the speeding lifter limousine, we saw steam rising from the empty, rain-washed streets. Despite his best efforts, the Lord Commander Helican would have clouds before noon. I leant forward in the car's passenger bay and straightened Ravenor's interrogator rosette. He looked nervous, a look I didn't associate with him. He also looked the very image of an inquisitor. I realized he didn't look nervous so much as just very young, like a man hurrying to join his drinking friends in the Thirsty Eagle off Zanzibar Street.
What is it?
He asked, smiling. I shook my head. This will be quite a day, Gideon. Are you ready for it?
Absolutely,
he said. I noticed he had added the tribe badge of Clan Essu Sweder to the decoration of his uniform. An appropriate touch, I remarked, pointing to it.
I thought so,
he said. At 10, the triumph began. A deafening roar of hooters and sirens blasted across the hive, followed by a mass cheer that quite took my breath away. By then the streets were packed with close on 2 billion jubilant citizens. 2 billion voices, raised as one. You cannot imagine it. In sunlit air vibrating with colossal cheering, the great triumph moved out from the armor depot. It was to follow an 18-kilometre route straight down the kilometre-wide avenue of the Victor Bellum, right into the heart of the hive and the monument of the ecclesiarch. Millions lined the way, cheering, applauding, waving banners and imperial flags. At the front rolled 80 tanks of the Thracian Fifth, pennants quivering from their aerial masts. Behind them, the colours band of the 50th Gudronite Rifles pumped out the stately March of the Primarchs. Next, the standard-bearers, 500 men carrying aloft the many regimental guidons and emblems representing the units and regiments that had participated in the Ophidian suppression. It took an hour for them alone to all pass. On their heels came the great standard of the Emperor, a vast Aquila symbol like a clipper's mainsail, so big it took a stocky, lumbering, unbelievably ancient dreadnought of the White Consuls to lift it and stop it being carried away by the wind. The dreadnought was escorted by 5 Baneblade super-heavy tanks. Behind that rolled the dead. Every Imperial corpse recovered from the closing stages of the war, loaded in state into 1,500 rhino carriers painted black for the duty. 100 mighty space marines of the Aurora chapter marched beside the trundling machines, holding up black ribboned placards on which the names of the dead were etched in gold leaf. It was noon by the time the marching ranks of the rest of Aurora Chapter, all in full polished Imperator armor, moved by. The massive cheering had not yet diminished. After the Space Marines came 60,000 Thracian troops, 30,000 from Gudrun, 8,000 from Messina, 4,000 from Samothrace. Breastplates and lances glittered in the sun. Then the Navy officers from Battle Fleet Scarus in neat echelons. Then the white consuls, glittering and terrifying. Then the endless files of the Munitorum and the Administratum, followed by the slow-moving trains of the Astropathicus. A dull psychic discharge, like corpuscent, slithered and crackled around their carriages and their heads, and left a metallic taste in the air. The Titans of the Adeptus Mechanicus followed them. 4 warlords blotting out the sun, 8 grinding warhounds, and a massive super-titan called Imperius Vulcanus. It was as if significant sections of the hive itself had detached and begun walking. The vast crowds hushed as they thumped past, man-shaped mechanisms as tall as a steeple, taller yet in the case of Vulcanus. Their massive legs rose and fell in perfect synchronization. The ground shook. Unperturbed, 600 tech priests and magos of the Adeptus paraded casually between their feet. The tank brigades of the Narmenians and the Scuterans followed the god machines. 5,000 armor units, rolling forward under a haze of exhaust, barrels raised in salute. Tractors towed Earthshaker cannons behind them, 3 abreast, and then a seemingly endless flow of Hydra batteries, traversing their multiple barrels from left to right, like sun-following flowers. The ecclesiarchy followed, led by Cardinal Rochefort, who strode ahead of his 2,000 hierarchs barefoot. Cardinal Palatine Andarusius awaited us all for the blessing at the monument. From its muster point at the old founding fields, the Inquisition fell in line behind the priesthood, 600 strong. We were the only part of the triumph not to march in ordered ranks. We simply strode behind the ecclesiarch in a somber wedge. We were not uniform. All manner of men and women filled our ranks, all manner of appearances and aspects. Individuals walking, dressed in dark robes or leather capes, some with great entourages holding up the trains of gaudy robes, some on lifter thrones, some alone and dignified, some even hidden by personal void shields. Ravener and I walked together in the press, behind the extravagant ensemble of Inquisitor Eudora. Lord Orsini, the Grand Master, led us, his long purple vestments trained out behind him and supported by 30 servitors. At his side strode Lord Rorken of the Ordo Xenos, Lord Bezier of the Ordo Malleus, and Lord Sakharov of the Ordo Hereticus, Orsini's triumvirate. Sonic booms sounded over the hives as honor escorts of Thunderhawks flashed down above us. Fireworks banged and fizzed, staining the sky with quick blooms of color and light. At our backs came the triumphal procession of the War Master himself. Honorius rode with Lord Commander Helican, standing in a howdah built upon the humped back of the largest and most venerable Orocothir war beast. 10,000 men from their personal retinues marched together. 200 grunting, snuffling behemoths from the Orocothir cavalry. 800 Conqueror tanks. Lifter bikes skimmed alongside their line. The frenzied crowd strewed thousands of flowers in their path. Behind them all came the prisoners. Like the honored dead in the funereal rhinos, the prisoners were an open show of imperial heroism in general, and the War Master's heroism in particular. Honorius delighted in displaying their torment to the adoring populace. The sight of these great, potent creatures, cowed and submissive, made his own power manifest. There were several hundred foot soldiers, chained together at the hands and feet, shambling along in 2 wretched lines. Veterans of the Thracian Guard marched around them, lashing out with force poles and neural whips to drive them on. The crowd booed and howled and pelted the subjugated foe with bottles and rocks. 6 Trojan tank tractors, painted in the War Master's colors and teamed together like horses pulling a state landau, came behind the chained prisoners, towing a vast flatbed trailer designed to transport a super-heavy tank. On the flatbed, shackled in adamite and encased in individual void shield bubbles, were the 33 psychers, the greatest trophies of all. They were dim, contorted shapes, barely human, swimming in the milky green cocoons of the imprisoning shields. Along with the white consuls guarding the tractor team, 200 astro-telepaths strode alongside it, mentally reinforcing the void bubbles that were damping the psychic fury of the captives. Frost coated the metal of the flatbed. More psychic ball lightning drifted overhead. 20,000 men and 500 armored machines of the Thracian Interior Guard formed the tail of the Great Triumph, marching under the dual standard of Thracia and the War Master. After barely 15 minutes of walking in the immense procession, I was utterly numb. The noise of the crowd alone vibrated me to the very marrow. My diaphragm shook every time the flypast came in low, or when the great siege sirens of the Titans blasted. The scale of the occasion was overwhelming, the sensory assault bewildering. Seldom have I been so in awe of the power of my species. Seldom have I been so forcibly reminded of my place as a tiny cog in the workings of the holy imperium of mankind. Following the mighty avenue of the Victor Bellum, the Triumph passed under the Spatian Gate, a monolithic structure of glossy white etherite. The memorial gate was so cyclopean, even the Titans passed under it without difficulty. It had been raised to commemorate Admiral Lorpal Spatian, who had been killed in the early years of the Ophidian suppression during the magnificent fleet action that had taken Urachil 4.